Hey, welcome back for another episode of the Speak Life podcast. This week I have Dr. Matt Kimbrough. He's an associate professor of theology here at SBU, and we're going to really take some time to dive into what conflict and communication issues look like in the church, how they're challenged, and some specific pathways for dealing with those challenges. Welcome back to the Speak Life podcast. Hi, welcome back for another episode of the Speak Life podcast. This week I have Dr. Matt Kimbrough here with me. He is an associate professor of theology here at Southwest Baptist University. Matt, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. How are you, Bill?
I'm here. It's in the morning, and I've had some coffee, so I'm awake, and it's good.
Nice.
Well, I tell you what, as we get started, why don't you talk a little bit about your family, your history and ministry, just yourself, your backstory, things like that.
Yeah. Well, I grew up as a pastor's kid. My dad was typically had associate pastor type roles, youth ministry. They used to have the minister of education was kind of the old way to talk about big picture discipleship is sort of how we would label it today. But yeah, I grew up in the church, moved around a little bit between different churches in Texas, Louisiana, Southeast Missouri, eventually ended up in Springfield. And honestly, as a minister's kid, I was protected from a lot early on, but eventually I started to see sort of the dark side of church life. And so by the time we moved to Springfield and Dad transitioned out of full-time ministry, I was really at a place where I absolutely wanted to do anything other than vocational ministry. I mean, I didn't exactly say to God, I refuse to do that, but in essence, that's what I was feeling. By God's grace, I had a really, really great youth pastor named Doug Bischoff. And one of Doug's emphases as a youth minister was to give over responsibility to a lot of different elements of the youth ministry to youth leaders. So he had this group of specifically youth ministry leaders, and I was a part of that. And so he actually gave me the opportunity at 16 to take on a full modern style worship band. I mean, we're talking early 2000s at this point. And in fact, the people in the band were all adults and I was 16. So for one, I can't believe that they let me lead them. But when I look back on it, it just seems crazy. But yeah, every single Wednesday night, I would put together a whole worship set and lead the band and lead sing and play guitar. And that, I think, started to soften my heart a little bit, but I still wasn't ready for ministry. So when I graduated from high school, I went to Memphis to a music school, wanting nothing to do with the church. I was going to church. It was a Christian school, but I just wanted nothing to do with ministry still. And I refer to that as my running from Nineveh period. This is my Jonah in the boat moment.
Yeah.
And God allowed me to be really miserable. So that was the time when I actually dropped out of college my first semester and moved back home to the Springfield area and was just sort of like, God, what do you want for me? And I won't say that God spoke audibly to me, but it was clear enough in my heart that I knew he was specifically telling me I was going into ministry. And even I felt a strong sense of the Lord that ministry would be at my home church, which was Spring Hill. Now, wow. I'm just coming back. Actually, by the time I get back from college, we have a totally new pastor at Spring Hill who I've never met. So long story short, I started SBU then in January as a student. And by the time I turned 21, they brought me on as a part-time worship pastor at the church. That transitioned into 10 years of full-time vocational associate pastor type roles from a variety of things, from small groups to Sunday school to connections to, of course, music and worship and all that. And then, I did that for a little over a decade while I was getting higher ed, finished my PhD at Midwestern, and by God's grace ended up getting a teaching position. And so I've been doing that for, I think, 7 or 8 years at this point, doing full-time faculty work. And I'm still a lay or volunteer pastor at Spring Hill even today. So it's just kind of crazy, the whole circle of things. And God knew what he was doing, and even though I ran from it, he was really gracious to bring me back through the magic of pain and misery.
Yeah. Yeah. So as I listened to that, you and I have some similarities there. First of all, I'd forgotten that Doug Bischoff had been your youth minister
Oh, do you know
way back
Doug?
when. Doug and I went through the doctoral program together at Southwestern. We
Oh,
were
really?
so where he was majoring in student ministry for his
Yeah.
PhD. That was my minor, was student ministry, and so he
Okay.
and I had some seminars together. Great guy. I actually just
Yep.
ran across his name the other day, and I'm looking at inviting him to do the podcast.
Yeah.
So Doug, if you're watching, know that some communication is coming your way. Second of
Yeah.
all, you and I also have the similarity of we've served in various roles in the church and have gone through higher ed and been very concerned about and interested in uh, the ministry of the church doing well, but have not sat in the main role, and so have had a chance to observe different pastors in different churches in that role, and to be able to really see what goes on in ministry from a little bit different seat. And I think there's big benefit in that
Sure.
here in this venue, and thinking through the podcast topic, which the main topics for the podcast then are, what are the top two or three greatest challenges you've seen or experienced in ministry, and then what are the top suggestions you give for dealing with those challenges? So
Hmm.
what comes to mind for you?
Yeah, I mean, really, the first thing that comes to mind for me is just simply the topic of conflict. And conflict could take a lot of different perspectives. We could look at it from a lot
Mhm.
of different angles. Conflict with, as a vocational pastor, conflict with church members. But I think, at least what I personally have experienced and seen in others, is conflict with your fellow staff members specifically can be one of the most difficult things that you deal with in ministry, because for a variety of
Yeah,
reasons, these are people you see every day. These are people that are your team. These are people that typically ultimately have the same end goal, but maybe have different ideas of how to get there, or
yep,
just our own weaknesses and fleshliness that we still have to deal with. And so, even early on in my vocational ministry period, um, our church, I mean, ultimately the word is fired, but the technical term
yeah,
was asked, encouraged to resign, or asked to resign, or given the opportunity to resign. All
yeah,
those pieces. So I saw that early on. The first one I wasn't really a part of in any kind of way. The second one I had more more of a role to play in that conversation, and just the difficulty of the whole process leading up to it, all the way through it, trying to find a new normal as a team and sort of heal from a sense of brokenness as a team.
yeah.
And I guess what I realized was I had no practical skill to deal with conflict.
Hmm.
I mean, at the end of the day, I I felt like I had along the way a decent grasp of scripture, theology. Very interested in that. That's my main area of expertise, is Bible interpretation, theology, and those types of things. So I had that side of things, which I think is so absolutely important.
Yeah.
But I was lacking some really practical conflict related skill that, honestly, not until I designed a course called Conflict and Crisis in Ministry here at SBU for a master's degree did I finally dig in. And I, in many ways, it's been life changing for me, both in my lay pastor ministry role, in my personal relationships with family and friends, and in just work life even.
Yeah.
And so that for me is something that I wish we, broadly speaking, in higher ed, as far as theological training and such goes, I wish we really emphasized that. And in fact, when I became the division head over the Redford division of Christian ministry here at SBU, I met with a lot of pastors the first year or so.
Yeah.
And almost every time when I would meet with a pastor, I would ask them, hey, just if you were to design a ministry program, a ministry training program, like what's one thing you would want to make sure absolutely was included? Or sometimes I would ask it, hey, if you did seminary, what's the one thing you wished you would have learned? And
Yep.
almost to the man, the answer was how to deal with conflict, how to deal with personal crisis in the midst
Yep.
of ministry.
Yep. Yeah. Regularly, there's this sense of, well, I mean, we see pathways in scripture. Matthew 18 talks about how to deal with conflict, but
Sure.
it doesn't get into, okay, so what are the nuts and bolts of the actual conversation? It
Correct.
says who the conversations need to be with and what order you have those conversations in. But getting into the actual nuts and bolts of it, that that's left to the individual. And so being able to gain some of that training, I agree, is vitally important. And I'll say that as I've, this is episode, I think, 31 that we're recording today. And this is not the first time that conflict has come up as an
Yeah.
issue that people need
Yeah.
to deal with. Uh, Now, specifically in thinking about, well, there's always this one thing that comes to mind for me, specifically thinking about when there's conflict between staff members, because I've seen that as well.
Yeah.
And so I immediately understand that this doesn't, there are going to be some pastors who are listening that you don't feel like it applies to you because
Mm.
you're like, well, I'm the only staff member in my church, or
Yeah.
it's me and a
Yeah.
part-time guy. And we see eye to eye. Well, you also have other leaders in your church, whether they're Sunday
Right.
school leaders or chairman of the deacons. And so the people that you connect with the most in ministry, these same kind of principles are going to apply.
Yeah.
And I've seen two ways that I've seen at least one category where there's a fundamental difference in in what the pathway looks like for dealing with conflict. And, and so I don't know if this is something that you've considered as part of it or not. Here's what I'm talking about. I've seen issues where it is the disagreement over what ministry needs to be put first, something like that. We
Mm-hmm.
have so
Yep.
many resources. I feel like we really need to develop the student ministry. Well, no, I really feel like we need to develop the worship ministry, or I feel like we really need to develop the senior adult ministry. And there's only so much that a church can do with the limited amount of time and money that we all are subject to.
Yeah.
That's one kind of disagreement that people will struggle with and have to fight their way through. There are also challenges in terms of disagreement regarding just the different personalities in the room, right?
Yeah. Yep.
And that can lead to some challenges. But there's this other kind of disagreement, and when it's an underlying philosophical disagreement,
Yeah.
uh, where it's tied to their theology. So, for example, one of the places I've seen this played out is the church where you've got somebody on staff who really feels like we need to be moving towards elder led because from a theological perspective that's the only right way to do church, and then somebody else on staff that's really committed to a congregational model that says this is the only right way to do it from my perspective and a biblical point of view. And those are different
Right.
animals. They're
Right.
much more challenging to overcome. So what, as you're thinking through conflict between staff members, what comes to mind for you? What do we need to talk about here?
Yeah. I think this is anecdotal. I'm trying to think if I've read this in any book. I don't want to jump ahead too much, but there's a book called Firestorm that by a guy named Ron
Ron
Susek. I
Susek.
really, really like.
Yep.
I think it just walks through the issues really well. And so it's been a while since I read it all the way through closely. Okay,
Yep.
but I think based on books like that and other research that I've done and just anecdotal experience, what I think is that the theological side of things is maybe 10% of the conflict. Like if you went and surveyed churches,
Yep.
I think generally speaking, people end up on staffs and leadership roles, etc., with reasonably close theological convictions, I think.
Yeah.
Now, of course, things can happen and come up. So my experience, what I think is true is that 90% of the time it's more personality, priority. And the other thing that I would add to that I think is typically at the root is just a simple lack of clarity.
Mm.
I think a lack of clarity can be, at least as a significant element of most church-related conflicts, especially among staff, that I experience. And frankly, in most relationships, I think that's probably true. I have a certain set of expectations. You have a certain set of expectations. We don't communicate those expectations,
Yep.
and now we're frustrated when our expectations don't meet up. Even for example, depending on your lead pastor, so your senior pastor type role and what approach to leadership this individual might choose to take. Maybe they're a more hands-off person, which
Yep.
for someone like me, I prefer that. Be hands-off, trust me to do my job well,
Yep.
check in, be an encourager, but trust me to do what I need to do. But I've worked with other staff members who go, "No, I want more guidance. I want more leadership from you. I want to understand exactly what you're thinking and what you hope that I do, and when I'm doing well and when I am not doing well. So some
Yep.
people just want more guidance or less guidance. So that's a communication, a clarity issue. How much guidance is best? How much guidance do I want to give as a lead person? How much guidance do I want to receive as a subordinate? So I think those types of things can be really relevant, and just simple communication issues. I forgot to tell you this. Oh, I was actually
Yep.
planning to do this event down the road, but you already have something planned there. And now what are we going to do? I think actually a lot of it's just very simple communication,
Yeah.
clarity. Let's be on the same page. And, there's kind of the idea, the myth of communication, that I said something, or I think I communicated clearly, so I must have communicated clearly, when somebody else is going, I have no idea what you're talking about or what you're thinking.
Yeah.
So that's one area that I really try to emphasize just in my own teaching for my students. Communicate, be very, very clear in everything that you do to the best of your God given ability.
Yeah. So first of all, going back a little bit, I completely agree with what you're saying about the percentages of what disagreements, what conflict, what leads to somebody being invited to resign is typically tied to that same book, Firestorm. I used to teach from in a
Okay.
relationships and ministry class back at Southwestern. It's a
Hmm.
great book, and I recommend it to several pastors just to kind of have your eyes open to what can happen.
Yeah.
Um, After that, one of the things you mentioned was leadership style and how that plays a role. Like I'm thinking through scenarios that I've seen where, like, I'm thinking of a church that had one of those more hands off kind of pastors.
Hmm.
Like, we've hired good people and I'm going to trust them to do what they need to do. And within that, then there's a little bit of a communication breakdown that can happen
Sure.
if you let it be too much disconnect.
Yep.
Well, then there was a transition where somebody else came in and they were not the hands off. It was, we need to, I expect you to be here all the time and in the office on a regular basis. And we need to be able to meet and have meetings on a regular basis and things like that. And it did not go well.
Yeah.
I think 3 staff members left. It was a bad deal. And so thinking through those dynamics and how those differences work in a multi-staff church, uh, is pretty important. It reminds
Hmm.
me of a conversation I had with Dr. Randy Stone, who is down at New Orleans Seminary, and he talked through the idea of when a church is going through a transition, they don't necessarily do a great job of. Everybody talks about, all the books that are out there do a great job talking about how to do a pastoral search and
Hmm.
how to put together a pastor search committee and how to have the congregation involved. But there aren't as many things out there. There really aren't any resources out there that talk well about, hey, how do you get the other staff involved
Hmm.
and that kind of thing. And so that's one of the
Yeah.
places where that kind of issue can show up in terms of conflict when there's the leadership change. But coming back to more of what you're talking about in the everyday, in the things that the church does on a regular basis, this notion of needing to be able to communicate well and communicate with good clarity. Yeah, I agree. I think that's vitally important. What are the things you've seen be most helpful with that in particular?
Boy, that's a good question. Let me back up to one thing that you mentioned on the search process, because one thing that I've seen and experienced is a lot of times, and I don't think this is just churches, but that's my primary experience. I think a lot of times churches, especially with a senior pastor role, when one senior pastor leaves, churches tend to hire the exact opposite skill set.
Hmm.
So maybe you had a really relational pastor who wasn't very organized and, struggled with administrative work. Well, then the next person, you're thinking, I really want someone who has great administrative ability. So you hire that
Yeah.
person, but then they're lacking the relational skill, may potentially, that you are used to. So it's kind of interesting how we have this pendulum swing, or almost like a ping pong
Hmm.
back and forth sometimes. And I think that might be an area of caution for churches to think, okay, every one of us has weaknesses,
Right.
plural, and that's something to consider. What weaknesses can I put up with? Part of the equation for that should be, what team do I have in place?
Yeah.
So, for example, when I was at Spring Hill, I'm a more administrative person. That's just kind of my natural skill set.
Hmm.
I can think strategically. I can plan well, etc. So when we brought in someone who had the same skill set to be a lead pastor,
Yeah.
we clashed a little bit more, just because we're stepping on each other's toes. And I was used to having sort of running the church in the background while a senior pastor did more of the pastoral care, relationships, obviously preaching.
Yep.
And then all of a sudden my role completely shifted because I had a more similar skill set to the person that came in. So I think you talked about involving the staff. The question is,
Hmm.
who are your staff? What is their skill set? What gifts has God given them spiritually? What do they know how to do? And find a lead person to complement that. And then vice versa, if you're hiring an associate pastor or something, what's the skill set of the lead pastor and how can I
Yeah.
complement it, rather than the lead pastor going, well, I want to hire someone who has the same personality as me because I know we'll get along.
Yeah.
Well, yeah,
Yeah.
maybe to some extent, but is that a complementary relationship, or are you running on the same track? So I think that's a really important component, just with kind of that hiring piece that you were talking about.
Yeah. I think there's definitely more intention that needs to be considered there when you're at a multi-staff church and you're hiring.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Yeah. So with the communication element, I don't know a specific, a really good solution to the issue, other than
mhm.
demand of yourself that you are going to communicate as clearly as possible. I think finding people that can communicate really well and clearly, and utilizing their skill. If you're someone who you think, even writing an email, I mean, there's a certain art to it. How long should the email be? How specific?
Yeah.
I mean, there's just so many elements. You think about your church. What are our communication opportunities? I went and preached at a church recently, and they have an app. I can't remember what app it is, but it's an app that their whole church uses, and you can group up in the app. So the different Sunday schools have their own unique component, and it, from my perspective, seemed to allow just a lot of really precise, quick,
Yeah.
scene communication, which I know a lot of us have struggled with just in church life. But I think maybe making time to really think through the implications, especially of larger decisions. What are all the parties that this affects? Have I had conversations with people? How have I communicated? Have I communicated as many ways as possible? Verbally, video announcements, email, maybe a mailer. Just being as clear with communication with the church, I think, is important.
Yeah.
As a staff, to have staff meetings where you're really talking about the things that matter. So it's not just a weekly meeting or a whatever, however often meeting for the sake of having a meeting, but we're being very, very intentional. You have the freedom to ask
Yep.
questions, to get as much clarification as you need. I think those are maybe some tools, but man, it's a moving target for sure.
Yeah. Well, so here's part of what's hiding in there is the idea of, if you're going to do that well, you need to think of it less in terms of I'm going to commit to this, to more in terms of we need to build a culture
Yeah,
around clear communication. And the
sure.
good news is, I mean, so it's easiest if the senior pastor is the one who is intentionally facilitating that culture, that recognizes the value of it and intentionally facilitates that culture, bringing up things in meetings, making sure that there's I'll just use the phrase communication strategy. This is how
Yeah,
we're going to do things. This is where, if it's an event that's 4 weeks out, that's 8 weeks out, we're going to start communicating it. I almost think of it like pregnancy doctor's appointments to an extent, right? Like
yeah,
when mama's getting ready to have a baby, it's monthly at first, then every other week, then weekly right up until the baby's born. So I
right,
wonder if there's a pathway, like if there's a registration for a mission trip coming up, if you
right.
communicate that early and then you increase that communication as that deadline's approaching to make sure that everybody gets the message. And it's going to be in the church newsletter and in the bulletin on a weekly basis and in the video announcements, if you do video announcements, whatever it is, you're
Yeah,
going to make sure that's communicated. And so developing that communication strategy, I think, is important. But I also want to point out, I don't think it has to be the senior pastor. If you're listening to
yeah,
this and you're an associate pastor, you can be the one to start to be more intentional
right.
about communicating with clarity and asking those questions,
Yes,
uh, and help to build that culture, that atmosphere, that this is how we do things around here mentality of
right.
having that level of clarity. And I think that's really important.
Yeah. Yeah. And just when you notice an issue, call out the issue and try to brainstorm a solution.
Yeah.
I think of an example where, our maybe a more relational senior pastor, in my experience, he was at all the hospital visits. Like, that was his passion, and he is excellent at it. And so what sometimes wouldn't happen was the staff would not receive communication about who was in the hospital and what was going on.
Yeah.
And then 3 weeks go by, and old Shirley had been in the hospital for 3 weeks, and I had no idea. And she's a key,
Mhm.
volunteer in my
Yeah.
ministry, or I have really a close relationship with their family, and I just had zero communication.
Yeah.
So it was really kind of forcing the development of a habit. When you hear about an issue, will you please just shoot us a text? Basic
Yep.
information, then I know to ask you about it and check in on what's going on. Otherwise, you're just out of the office. I know you're at the hospital. I don't know who you're visiting, and don't know what's going on. So even some of those things that aren't communication to the rest of the church are just some internal pieces that can create some frustration if we don't find a plan and fully address it.
Yeah. Now, one of the things you mentioned in the middle of that, and I'm already detecting, I'm paying attention to the time, and I'm realizing we talked earlier about having multiple topics, and I don't know that we're going to get past this one, man.
That's
Uh,
fine.
uh, you mentioned in there the idea of, if something happens, call it out. If you see something where something's gone awry,
Yeah.
call it out. Uh, that seems to me to be one of the biggest hangups that people struggle with, and I'm guessing
Yes.
it's one of the things you intentionally talk about in your class on conflict that you teach.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So in my class on conflict, we spent about half the semester working through, I call it still conversations, STIL, speaking truth in love from
Hmm.
Ephesians chapter 4. So that's kind of how I've labeled it. But how do we have these conversations, whether they're on a crucial, deep issue or whether it's just some surface level frustration, all the way from should I address this or should I forgive this, all the way to actually what
Yeah.
we just finished talking about was how do we end the conversation with a clear, precise plan,
Yep.
and even build in follow up within that conversation. And I do think developing some of those skills, it it provides a sense of freedom. Like maybe it seems a little formulaic, and my students have expressed this multiple times, and it
Yeah.
does. We're practicing a very specific formula of how to begin these conversations, how to listen well, how to
Yep.
respond to what we're doing, how to listen for a solution, how to end. It feels very formulaic, but I think what it does is it gives us at least a starting point.
Yep.
It gives us a box. We can paint within the lines or we can paint outside the lines if we need to, but at least I feel like I have a basis, a foundation to
Yeah.
begin a conversation. So I do think those just simple, assertiveness skills, having a plan for how to have a good conversation,
Yep.
and even one of the things that I really emphasize, I take a week to talk about is our identity in Christ. I think that comes into the conflict element as well, because, for example, some of us are more approval oriented, and so we're very cautious about not doing anything that would cause you to not
Yeah.
approve of me, and so I'm not going to even voice a very, very serious concern. And my wife's a healthcare professional in her field that leads to death.
Hmm.
If you refuse to speak up because, well, I'm just a nurse or I'm just a this or that, and I know the doctor is about to kill this person, no, you have to speak up. And in
Yeah.
our world, we're talking about heaven and hell. We're talking about faith or doubt. We're talking about very serious things, and so I think it's crucial for us to develop some of these simple skills so that we feel comfortable to
Yeah.
be assertive when we need to.
Yeah. Now, as you're saying that, I'm recognizing one of the things that can be a challenge, and there's actually two things I want to speak to here. One of the things that can be a challenge is some of us grew up in homes that were not, we didn't see parents earning A pluses in their conflict resolution skills,
Yeah,
right?
probably most of us grew up
Yeah,
in those homes.
probably
Yeah,
most of us grew up in those environments. And so in some instances, uh, we haven't had modeled this is a good way to deal with conflict, or that even conflict can be a good thing. And so the
yeah,
idea of confronting a situation, confronting a person, it immediately starts to feel, it's a tension building experience before the words
absolutely.
even come out of the mouth. And so that
Yes.
leads me back to what you said in the middle of that, the idea that there's a very formulaic thing you do and it feels weird at first, but there's so much value in that. One of the things I do in my counseling classes, which, so for all of you listening, we're talking about the conflict class that Matt teaches and the one counseling class that I teach, they're back to back in the same room. So Matt and I
Yeah.
see each other every Tuesday afternoon. As he's finishing the conflict class, I'm walking in to teach local church counseling with some of those same students.
Yeah, you get to correct everything I say after I say it. That's that's
Yeah,
how it should
actually,
work.
I've cut some things out because you've already said them, and so
Oh,
I've
really?
I've switched some of my lectures up,
That's
which has
funny.
been a good thing. I have more time to talk about marriage counseling, which always shows up in a pastoral context. You're always going to do that in
Sure.
church.
Sure.
With all of that being said, when it comes to some basic counseling techniques, one of the things I talk about is the idea of getting from people easily will talk about an event that occurred,
Mm,
and people can easily start talking about rationalizing it, but they will more rarely go down to how it made them feel. And it's when our feelings get engaged that we actually will change a little
sure.
bit.
Sure.
And so I end up teaching my counseling students a very regimented. So when you're in counseling context and you recognize the emotion somebody's experiencing, excuse me, you start out, you feel, name the emotion because, and then name the reason why you're seeing that. And
Mm-hmm.
then shut up and get out of the way and let them process what they need
Yeah.
to process.
Yeah.
And I make them do that very formulaic, you feel because kind of statement over and over again until they get to the place where it's become so natural. Then they just transition to putting it into their own words.
Mm-hmm.
What's the formulaic thing that you've talked about regarding conflict?
I think the most helpful formula that I have spent a lot of time on, and it's presented a variety of different ways in different resources, but they all come back to the same idea. You start with what you experience, what you sense, what you see, what you hear,
Mm-hmm.
taste, smell, whatever. So with your senses, so the fact, and that leads to our interpretation. So we could say it leads to a story. That's, I think, where a lot of the rub comes in conflict is the story that I've created. I've got a limited set of facts, but I'm
Yep.
taking those facts and interpreting them in a certain kind of way. And sometimes my interpretation, my story may be accurate, and sometimes it may be utterly inaccurate. And a lot of what comes into our story is motive, which of course I
Mm-hmm.
can't know your motive unless you specifically tell me my motive is dot dot dot. So we come up with what we assume the motive is. That's our story. And I think those stories end up being what produce some of those maybe negative feelings within us.
Yeah.
Okay, so you didn't call me back. Why didn't you call me back? Well, now I'm creating a story. You must not respect me.
Mm-hmm.
That sense of a lack of respect makes me angry. And then that leads me, as you said, to act out in a certain way. Now, maybe I'm going to be passive about it. So I'll just give you the cold shoulder for a couple of weeks until hopefully I think you figure out that I have an issue with you, which of course just spirals into more conflict.
Yep.
But having that process in mind to say, really, at least from my perspective, where we need to spend a lot of time thinking is that story component. Is this an accurate story? What do I actually know versus what am I assuming based on the facts that I have? And what one of the things that I've trained the students to do, just to be silly about it, is to say, what's the most outlandish? So I'll give them situations. Here's the facts. What's
Yeah.
the most outlandish possible way you could imagine these facts came together? I mean, so why did this person not call you back? Maybe space aliens came down and they got abducted. I mean,
Yeah.
just to be silly with it, it
Yeah.
sort of, I think, breaks down this gate that we've built up in front of ourselves, and we go, maybe there are actual other possibilities. And therefore, when I have that conversation with you, I'm not coming in as hot as I would have if I were purely operating under my initial story, because I
Yeah.
realize there may be something else going on. It may be possible that I'm not omniscient and I didn't figure everything out
Yeah.
about this situation.
Yeah. There is a
And
God
so
out
I
there, and
can
I'm not
listen.
it.
Yeah, exactly. And
Yeah.
that puts me in the posture, more of a posture of listening
Yeah.
when I'm initiating this conversation versus I'm coming in to tell you what's up and to make sure you know what your problem is and you
Yeah.
change. And
Yeah.
I
So
think that's really, really helpful.
there are two things that come to mind. One, there's a humility in that, right?
Yes.
There's a humility in I don't have all the answers. Number two, what you're describing in psychological terms is a well-known belief issue, and it's called fundamental attribution error.
Okay.
It's the idea that we will read into situations things that are inaccurate. And it's one thing to do that when it is, and it's something we all do, by the way. It's one thing to do
Sure.
that when you're driving down the road and somebody cuts you off on their way
Yep.
down the road.
Yes.
So fundamental attribution error says when somebody does something to us, we will immediately attribute it to something about them as a person, an internal kind of attribution. Whereas if it's we do something like that, we will make an external attribution. We did it because of something going on. If I cut somebody off, it's because I'm in a hurry. If
Right.
they cut me off, it's because they're a jerk and they
Right.
don't
Right.
care about other people.
Yeah.
So it's a character reason. So it's
Yes.
one thing when it's that, and think for yourself times that you've experienced it when you've been in Aldi and somebody steps into the line in front of you, or somebody's walking through with screaming kids and not doing anything about it, or not doing what you think they should be doing about it, right?
Right.
It's that kind of stuff when you think about making that kind of attribution in one-off circumstances. But what if it's somebody that you work with and you're around on a regular basis and
Right.
you're regularly making those kinds of attributions,
Right.
not realizing that you don't have the full story?
Right.
Like maybe the reason somebody has been bad at communicating for the past month is because they just found out that somebody has cancer and they
Right.
haven't told anybody yet. They were pregnant and had a miscarriage. Like there are reasons things like that happen that we don't know. It comes back to that omniscience thing you talked about.
Yeah.
But we're all prone to jump to wrong conclusions.
Right.
It
Right.
happens with regularity, and can build up some of those negative feelings, and really based on false assumptions. And so the idea of being direct, being intentional about being direct, becomes so much more important.
Yeah, absolutely. And multiply that now in a church context where you have whole groups potentially that are assuming things, and now we're not actually listening to each other. So, I mean, that's where the firestorm comes in, and we have this sort of
Yeah,
vicious circle where until clear communication begins to take place, absolutely wrapped in humility,
yeah,
there is no solution that really is going to solve the issue. And so, yeah, when we can start thinking through those processes, and then that all plays out in the conversations that we have, to say,
yeah,
hey, I'm coming to you because I want to hear the story. I want to understand the story. Here's the facts that I saw. Here maybe is my story. Here, tentatively, here's what I think. Is this actually true? Is it
yep.
not true? Can you fill in the gaps for me? And let's work through this process till we arrive at a point of understanding and we can move forward.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. Thank you for sharing. And unfortunately, I can tell we are out of time. You mentioned briefly identity and Christ in there. I think Matt, I'd love it if we could find a time to record again
Sure.
sometime down the line, maybe after the semester's over and the students are gone. We can find a time to record and just talk about some of those other things that you wanted to bring up today.
Yeah.
Thank you again for being on with me today, Matt. And for all of
Thanks for having
you
me.
watching and listening, thanks for joining us. And we will have a new episode for you next week. God bless.